The hall was glowing with golden lights and soft music filled the air, and every guest was dressed in fancy clothes, smiling and taking pictures as they waited for the bride and groom to make their grand entrance, and the place looked like a dream, where everything sparkled and everyone wanted to be seen. But in the middle of all that laughter and perfume and glitter, one girl quietly walked through the doors wearing a plain blue dress that looked so simple that some people thought she had come to the wrong event, and her hair was tied in a simple bun, and she carried a small old purse close to her side as she slowly stepped forward, looking around the room. People started to whisper right away, and some even laughed softly, hiding their mouths behind their hands, and one lady whispered to her friend saying, "Did you see her dress? It looks like something from a thrift store." And another replied, "Maybe she could not afford anything better," and they both laughed quietly, but their eyes stayed on her every move. The girl's name was Maya, and she heard every word, but she kept her head up and tried to smile, and she did not walk fast or look down, and her eyes looked calm, but deep inside her heart was beating fast, and she wished for the courage to keep walking because she knew why she was there, and nothing would stop her, not even the cruel looks around her. The bride's friends were standing near the front, and they noticed Maya too, and they started whispering and giggling, and one of them said, "Why would anyone wear that kind of dress to such a beautiful wedding?" And another added, "Maybe she wants to get attention," and the group laughed again, not knowing the truth that was hiding behind that plain blue fabric. As Maya took a seat at the back, some people moved a little away, pretending to make space, but really wanting distance, and she could feel their judgment in the air. And even though she smiled politely, her eyes held a kind of sadness that few could understand, and the wedding that was supposed to be full of love already felt heavy to her. On the stage, the groom Ethan was talking with some relatives and laughing politely. But when he turned his head, his eyes met Maya's for just a second, and something in his smile changed, and it was quick but real, like a spark of surprise mixed with something deeper, and he froze for a moment before pretending to look elsewhere. The bride Lila noticed it too, and her happy smile turned tight as she followed Ethan's gaze and saw Maya sitting quietly at the back of the hall, and Lila did not recognize her. But the look in Ethan's eyes made her chest feel strange, and her mind began to fill with questions she did not want to ask, and for a moment she forgot to keep smiling at the guests. People kept arriving, and the music grew louder, and waiters served drinks and snacks. But for Maya, everything felt distant and slow, and she could hear laughter around her that did not sound kind, and every whisper felt like a small cut on her heart, and she wanted to leave, but something stronger kept her there, because she had promised someone long ago that she would come, no matter what. A little girl ran past her and dropped a napkin, and Maya bent down to pick it up and smiled at the child, who looked at her shyly before running back to her parents, and for a second, Maya felt lighter, like maybe not everyone here was unkind, and she looked at the stage again at Ethan, who was now looking down, pretending to listen to someone talking, but his eyes still seemed thoughtful. The ceremony was about to begin, and the guests started finding their seats, and the room became quieter. And as the music changed, Maya's heart started to race faster because she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. And she whispered something softly under her breath like a prayer that no one could hear, and held the hem of her dress tightly in her fingers. Lila began walking down the aisle, and everyone turned to look at her, shining in her white gown covered with jewels and lace, and people clapped and smiled and took pictures and called her beautiful and elegant and perfect, and the air was full of admiration. But in the back corner, Maya sat still watching, with soft eyes and a sad smile that no one noticed, and as Lila reached the stage, Ethan reached out to take her hand and smiled at her. But when his eyes lifted, they found Maya again, and that same unspoken look returned, and for the first time Maya felt tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them away and forced a small smile, because she could not let anyone see her cry, especially not today. The music faded, and the priest began to speak about love and loyalty, and the guests listened with smiles, but Maya's mind drifted away into memories of another time when laughter was real and kindness was simple, and she remembered a promise, a voice and a face that she would never forget, and that plain blue dress she wore was the only thing she had left from that memory. No one around her knew that the simple fabric of her dress carried a story deeper than any jewel or gown in that room, and as she sat there surrounded by judgment and whispers, she told herself quietly that one day the truth would be known, and that the people who laughed would finally understand why she came dressed the way she did. And at that moment, as the ceremony continued, Ethan looked once more toward Maya, and his eyes filled with something unspoken, something heavy, something true. And though no one else saw it, that silent exchange marked the beginning of a truth that would soon break every heart in that hall and change the way everyone saw the girl in the plain blue dress forever. The sound of soft music filled the air again, and guests began talking as the ceremony ended and people started moving toward the tables for dinner, and laughter echoed across the hall. But among all the glitter and smiles, Maya sat quietly at her place, her hands resting on her lap as she watched everyone walk past her, pretending not to see her. And even those who looked her way quickly turned their heads as if she were invisible. The bride Lila was surrounded by her friends who kept taking pictures and complimenting her gown, and she smiled for them. But her mind was not calm because she had seen how Ethan's eyes had found that plain girl again and again during the ceremony. And no matter how hard she tried, she could not forget that small, strange look on his face whenever he glanced at Maya. Ethan, on the other hand, was busy greeting relatives and old friends and shaking hands. But behind his polite smile, his heart felt heavy and distracted, and every few moments his eyes wandered to the back of the hall where Maya still sat quietly near the wall, watching everything. Like she did not belong yet, somehow could not leave, and he wondered if she remembered what day it was and why this moment felt so important to both of them. The lights changed and waiters began serving food and glasses clinked, and the smell of sweet dishes filled the air. But the laughter around Maya grew louder, because a few of the guests at the next table had noticed her again, and they started whispering, in mocking tones, saying, "Look at her sitting all alone like she owns the place." And one woman said, "I bet she wasn't even invited properly." And another said, "Maybe she is just trying to impress the groom with that innocent face." And they all laughed, behind their napkins, while Maya looked down at her hands, pretending not to care. But her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up a glass of water, and her throat felt tight, and she took a slow breath, telling herself that she would not cry. Not in front of people who did not know the truth. And she reminded herself of the promise she made long ago to be strong and kind, no matter how cruel the world became around her. Across the room, Ethan's mother noticed Maya too, and leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Who is that girl, and why does she look so familiar?" And her husband shrugged, saying maybe she is from the bride's side, but she frowned and said, "No, I don't think so. Her dress is far too simple for anyone from that family," and she shook her head in disapproval. Meanwhile, Lila's best friend Hannah had also spotted Maya, and she whispered something into Lila's ear, making Lila glance back over her shoulder and see Maya sitting there again, and Hannah giggled, saying maybe she is an old girlfriend, and Lila forced a smile and said that's impossible. But inside her chest, something twisted, and her perfect evening started to feel uneasy. The music grew louder again as the band began to play, and couples started dancing near the stage, and people clapped and laughed, and lights sparkled everywhere. But Maya stayed where she was, quietly sipping her water and watching Ethan from afar, her eyes soft yet sad, as if she was remembering something too painful to speak of. And she whispered to herself under her breath, "I kept my word. I am here." Ethan finally excused himself from his group and walked toward the side of the hall, pretending to look for someone, and as he passed near Maya, their eyes met for the first time that night, and she froze, unable to move or speak. And he gave her a small nod, almost invisible but full of emotion. And in that brief moment, the whole world seemed to go quiet around them. Lila saw it from a distance, and her hands clenched tightly around her bouquet, and her heart began to pound as she whispered to herself, "Who is she? Why does he look at her that way?" And she felt a storm of questions growing inside her head, and no answer could calm it. The guests around Maya noticed the groom's glance, and their whispers grew louder, and one man joked, saying, "Looks like someone caught the groom's eye," and his wife nudged him, telling him to stop. But she giggled anyway, and soon a few others joined in, laughing softly behind their drinks, and their words floated through the air like sharp little knives. Maya felt her cheeks heat up, and she wanted to disappear into the floor, but she stayed still because she knew that running away would break her promise. And she closed her eyes for a moment, remembering a voice from long ago that said, "If you ever feel alone, wear this dress and I will be with you." And she held the fabric tightly between her fingers like it could give her courage. At the front of the hall, Ethan's father stood up and raised a toast, and everyone cheered for the newly married couple, and glasses clinked again. But Ethan's voice sounded distant even to himself as he thanked everyone politely, because all he could think about was the girl sitting quietly at the back, wearing that plain blue dress that once belonged to someone he could never forget, as people danced and took photos. Maya finally stood up and walked toward the garden outside to get some air, and the soft night breeze touched her face, and for a moment she felt peace, and she whispered into the wind, "I hope you are proud of me." And then she turned back to look through the glass doors at the bright hall where laughter still filled the room. Inside the hall, Lila was still watching her with a frown, while Ethan's gaze followed Maya's every step, and the air between them grew heavier with questions unspoken and truths untold, and somewhere deep inside both of them knew that this night was far from over, and the real story of the plain dress had only just begun. The night grew louder as the band played cheerful music and guests began to dance under the golden lights, and laughter filled every corner of the hall. But beneath all that joy, a quiet tension started to rise like a shadow creeping between the smiles, because the bride Lila could not take her eyes off the girl in the plain blue dress. Every time she looked at Ethan, she noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward the back of the hall where Maya had returned from the garden and was now sitting again quietly. Her hands folded in her lap, her expression soft but unreadable, and Lila's heart twisted with a feeling she could not name, something between fear and jealousy and anger. Her friends noticed her silence, and Hannah leaned closer, whispering softly, "Are you okay, Lila? You seem upset." And Lila forced a smile, shaking her head, saying, "I am fine." But her voice trembled, and Hannah followed her gaze and smirked, saying, "Oh, it is her, isn't it, that plain girl?" And Lila's lips tightened as she replied, "I don't even know who she is, but I am going to find out." Meanwhile, Ethan was trying to keep up with the guests who wanted to take pictures and congratulate him, but his mind kept slipping away every time he saw Maya, and he remembered the last words of his sister before she passed away, saying, "Promise me you will never forget her." And he had promised with tears in his eyes, and now seeing Maya in that dress made his heart ache. The laughter around them grew louder, and the dance floor sparkled with moving colors. But Maya stayed still, like she did not belong in that world of lights and glitter, and her eyes looked tired yet kind, and she smiled politely whenever someone walked past her, even though most people did not smile back, and her heart whispered, softly, "I did what I said I would do." After a while, the bride and groom were called to the center of the hall for their first dance, and everyone clapped as Lila and Ethan stepped onto the dance floor holding hands. But the moment their fingers touched, Lila could feel that something was missing in his smile. It looked warm but distant, like his heart was somewhere else, and she could not ignore that. As they began to dance, slowly, the guests surrounded them, taking photos and cheering. But Lila leaned close to him, whispering, "Ethan, who is that girl at the back?" And Ethan froze for a second before replying quietly, "She is just someone I know from a long time ago." And Lila's eyes darkened as she whispered back, "Just someone you know? Then why do you keep looking at her?" Ethan said nothing and looked away, his jaw tightening, and the silence between them felt heavy and strange. And when the song ended, Lila pulled her hand away too quickly and walked off the dance floor, pretending to fix her dress. But her heart was beating hard and her mind was filled with anger and confusion. Hannah and the other bridesmaids followed her to the corner near the mirrors and started whispering again, saying, "You have to ask him what is going on." And Lila nodded, but her voice trembled as she said, "No, I will talk to her first." And before anyone could stop her, she turned and began walking toward Maya, who looked up in surprise as the bride in white approached her. The music faded a little as the next song began, and a few guests noticed the scene, quietly watching as Lila stopped in front of Maya and said in a polite tone that carried a sharp edge, "Hello, I don't think we have met before." And Maya stood slowly, bowing her head slightly, and said, softly, "My name is Maya. I'm sorry if I made anyone uncomfortable." Lila's smile was small and tight as she said, "Uncomfortable? No, not at all, but I just could not help noticing that you seem to know my husband quite well." And Maya's eyes widened slightly as she looked toward Ethan, who was watching them from across the hall, and she said quietly, "I knew him and his family a long time ago, and that is all." But Hannah, who stood nearby, giggled and said, "Well, that explains why you are here then," and one of the other bridesmaids whispered, "Maybe she came to see what she missed," and they all laughed under their breath, thinking no one could hear them. But their laughter cut through the air like glass, and Maya's eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide. Lila saw the tears, and for a moment her anger softened, but her pride kept her from apologizing, and she simply turned away, saying, "Well, I hope you enjoy the evening," and walked back toward the stage while her friends kept whispering behind her, and Maya sat back down holding the edge of her dress in her hands. Trying not to shake, Ethan had seen everything, and his face had turned pale, and he started walking toward Maya. But before he could reach her, his mother stopped him, saying, "Ethan, we need you for a family photo." And he looked torn for a moment before nodding quietly and following her. Though his heart was pulling him in the opposite direction, as the evening went on, the whispers around the hall only grew stronger, and Maya became the quiet target of every curious glance and mocking smile. And even though she stayed calm, her mind was spinning with memories of the past, of Ethan's sister, of the promise she had made, and the reason she could not leave before he knew the truth. The night moved toward its peak, and the master of ceremonies announced that the groom would soon give his speech, and everyone clapped and cheered, not knowing that the truth hidden behind that plain blue dress was about to come out, and the words spoken next would silence the laughter of the whole room and turn the wedding into a moment no one would ever forget. The night was glowing brighter than ever, and the music echoed softly through the hall as the guests clapped and laughed, and the smell of food and flowers filled the air. But deep inside Ethan's chest, his heart was beating louder than the music, because he knew that the moment he had been avoiding was now standing right in front of him, and there was no way to escape it anymore. The host on stage tapped the microphone and said in a cheerful voice, "Now it is time for the groom to say a few words," and the crowd cheered and raised their glasses, and Ethan smiled weakly, walking up the steps toward the mic while his hands trembled slightly and his eyes looked across the sea of faces searching, until they found Maya sitting quietly near the back of the hall. Lila watched him carefully, her smile fixed and shining for the crowd, but her eyes filled with unease because she could feel that something was coming, something she was not prepared for, and she whispered under her breath, "Please don't do anything strange, Ethan." But he did not hear her because his thoughts were already far away, lost in memories that hurt and healed at the same time. The hall went quiet as Ethan held the microphone and the lights shimmered across his face, and he took a deep breath, his voice low but steady as he said, "Thank you everyone for coming today. This day means more to me than I can ever say, and I know everyone expects me to talk about my bride and our love story, but before I do that, I want to talk about someone else." A soft murmur ran through the crowd, and people turned their heads wondering who he meant. And Lila's smile began to fade slowly as she looked at him in confusion, while Maya lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around her small purse because she already knew this moment was about her, and she was not sure if her heart could handle it. Ethan continued speaking, his eyes still on Maya, his voice shaking slightly as he said, "I see someone here tonight wearing a blue dress, and I want everyone to know why that dress means more to me than anything else in this room." And the whispers began again, people looking around until their eyes fell on Maya, who sat frozen in her seat, unable to move. Lila's friends exchanged glances, and one whispered, "Oh no, he is talking about her." And Lila felt her chest tighten as her fingers gripped her gown and her thoughts raced in panic. But Ethan kept talking, his voice soft yet strong like a wave breaking against the silence. He said, "That dress belonged to my sister," and for a moment the whole room froze, and even the band stopped playing, and only the faint sound of the air conditioner filled the hall as Ethan took another breath, his eyes glassy with tears, and said, "My sister loved that dress more than anything, and when she got sick she gave it to her best friend and told her to keep it safe and wear it on my wedding day, so she could be with us in spirit." A few people gasped softly and others covered their mouths in shock, and the mocking laughter that had floated through the room earlier vanished like smoke, and every eye turned toward Maya, who now had tears shining in her eyes as she looked down, whispering softly, "I promised her I would." Ethan continued, and his voice grew more emotional as he said, "Maya was there for my sister every single day when she was sick, when everyone else was too busy or too scared. Maya stayed. She made her laugh, She made her believe that she could still see one more sunrise, and when she passed away, Maya was the one who held her hand until the very last moment. The crowd was silent, and even Lila felt her anger melting into guilt as she remembered how she had spoken to Maya earlier, and she wanted to disappear from the shame that now sat heavy in her chest while Ethan wiped his eyes and said, "I would not have made it through that time without Maya's kindness, and my family would not have survived that loss without her strength." Ethan paused, his voice breaking as he said, "She is the reason I learned what real love means, because love is not about how much you shine, it is about how much light you give to others." And as he said those words, Maya finally lifted her head and their eyes met across the hall, and there was no need for words because the silence between them said everything. The guests sat still, lost in the emotion of his story, and a few of them began to cry quietly, while others looked down ashamed of the cruel things they had whispered earlier, and even Ethan's mother wiped her tears, whispering softly, "I had no idea." Lila took a deep breath and slowly stood up, her heart trembling, and she looked at Maya, her voice quiet, as she said, "I am sorry." And Maya shook her head softly, saying, "You do not need to be." And in that moment, the cold distance between them melted into something human and real, something that went beyond pride and misunderstanding. Ethan smiled through his tears and said so. "Tonight I want to thank her for keeping her promise, for bringing a part of my sister back to me, and for reminding me that the most beautiful things in life are often the simplest." And the crowd began to clap slowly at first, then louder, filling the hall with sound and warmth. Maya stood from her seat, bowing her head shyly as people turned toward her, clapping and smiling now with respect instead of mockery, and her heart felt light, like a burden had finally lifted after years of silence and pain, and she whispered softly into the air, "Thank you for keeping your promise too." As Ethan looked out over the room, his eyes glowed with peace, and he said quietly to himself, "She would have loved this." And the music began again, soft and gentle, as if the world itself had changed, and everyone in that room knew that they had just witnessed something far more powerful than a wedding speech. They had witnessed truth. The hall was silent as the last echo of Ethan's voice faded into the air, and every guest sat still, their eyes wide and hearts heavy, because the truth had landed like a wave, washing away every whisper, every cruel word, every laugh that had once filled the room. And now all that remained was a deep quiet, filled with emotion and regret. Maya stood frozen near the back, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down at her plain blue dress that suddenly felt heavier than before, because it carried memories too deep for words, and she could almost hear the voice of Ethan's sister in her mind, laughing softly the way she used to when life still felt light and full of hope. And Maya closed her eyes for a second, whispering silently, "I kept my promise." Ethan's mother walked toward her, slowly, tears shining in her eyes, and the crowd moved aside to make space, and when she reached Maya, she took her hands gently, saying, "I am sorry, my dear. I did not know." And Maya smiled weakly, shaking her head, saying, "You do not have to be sorry. She loved you all so much, and she wanted you to smile today." And for a moment the older woman hugged her tightly, like a mother who had just remembered what love truly meant. Lila watched this from the stage, her heart heavy and her eyes wet with tears that she tried to hide behind her trembling hands, and she thought about how she had judged Maya without knowing her story, and how her words earlier had cut deep, without reason, and guilt filled her chest until she could no longer stand still. So she stepped down slowly, her heels clicking softly against the floor as the crowd turned to look at her. She walked toward Maya, her voice shaking as she said, "I owe you an apology." And everyone watched as the bride in her shining white gown stood face to face with the girl in the plain blue dress, and the difference between them had never looked more clear. And yet somehow in that moment it no longer mattered, because what stood between them was not pride, but truth. Maya looked at her kindly, her eyes gentle, as she said, "You have nothing to apologize for." And Lila shook her head, saying, "I was unkind and unfair, and I am so sorry for that." And Maya smiled softly, saying, "It is all right. We all make mistakes, and what matters is that we learn from them." And Lila nodded, wiping her tears as the crowd quietly watched, moved by the sight before them. Ethan came down from the stage too, his steps slow and steady, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. and when he reached her, he stopped a few feet away. His voice, low but warm as he said, "Thank you for keeping her promise. I did not think you would come." And Maya's eyes filled with tears again as she said, "I told her I would no matter what, and that you would know she was there with you." The air around them felt heavy with emotion, and for a long moment no one spoke. And then Ethan smiled sadly, saying, "She would have been so happy to see you here." And Maya nodded, whispering, "She is happy, I can feel it." And her voice broke slightly as she added, "She always, wanted to see you smile again, and tonight she finally can." Around them, the guests began to whisper softly, but the whispers were no longer cruel. They were filled with warmth and respect, and people nodded to each other, as if they too had learned something important, something that could not be taught by words alone. An elderly man near the front said in a quiet voice, "That girl has more grace than anyone in this room," and others agreed, their eyes soft with shame and admiration. And for the first time that evening, Maya did not feel like an outsider. She felt seen and understood, and it was a feeling she had not known for a very long time. The lights dimmed a little and the music began again. But it was different now. Softer, slower, full of meaning. And the host took the microphone, saying, "Tonight we witnessed not just a wedding, but a reminder of what love and kindness really look like." And everyone clapped again, not out of habit, but out of respect. Ethan's mother walked back to the stage holding the microphone, saying, "I want to thank Maya for reminding us of my daughter's heart and her kindness and her love and the way she always saw the good in everyone." And her voice cracked as she said, "I had forgotten that part of her, and now I remember, and I am grateful." And people wiped their eyes quietly, moved by her words. Maya stood there quietly, her heart full and heavy at the same time, and she whispered to herself softly, "You see, your mother remembers." And somewhere, deep inside, she felt peace because she knew the promise she made had been fulfilled in the most beautiful way. Lila walked to Ethan and took his hand gently, saying, "You did the right thing." And he smiled at her with gratitude, and she nodded at Maya one last time before turning back toward the crowd, her heart no longer filled with jealousy but with quiet respect for the girl who had brought back a piece of the past they all needed to remember. The laughter that filled the hall now was different. Too, it was light and real and warm, and when people looked at Maya, they no longer saw a poor girl in a plain dress. They saw someone strong, someone brave, someone who had carried love through pain and brought it back to life in one unforgettable evening. As Maya stood by the door looking out at the night sky, she could almost see Ethan's sister smiling in the stars, her voice soft and gentle, saying, "Thank you for keeping my promise." And Maya smiled back, whispering, "Always." And in that quiet moment before she left the hall, Maya finally understood that the plain dress she wore was not a sign of shame, but a symbol of love that never faded, and everyone who saw her that night would remember her, not for her clothes, but for her heart and the truth she carried. The night air was soft and cool outside the hall, and the stars above shimmered like little candles watching over everyone. And inside, the wedding music played slowly, filling the space with warmth and peace as the guests talked, in low voices, still touched by the story they had just heard. And every eye that had once looked at Maya with judgment now looked at her with respect and quiet admiration. Ethan stood near the stage, his eyes still glistening as he watched Maya walking slowly toward the exit, her blue dress swaying gently with each step. And for a moment he felt his sister's presence so close he almost heard her laughter echo softly in the distance, and he whispered under his breath, "I hope you are proud of her." And deep inside he knew the answer. Lila came beside him, her hand resting on his arm, and for the first time that night there was no jealousy in her heart, only understanding. And she said quietly, "She was never trying to take anything from us. She was only giving something back." And Ethan nodded, his eyes still following Maya, as she moved toward the door and said, "She gave us a piece of her and a piece of my sister too." The crowd began to gather around again, people whispering words like beautiful and powerful and unforgettable, and even the youngest guests, who did not fully understand, could feel that something special had happened that night, something that would stay with them forever.